Welcome back. I'm Dan.
And I'm Joe. Folks, today we have a treat for you.
Mm-hmm.
But first, please like, subscribe, share, bang that notification bell, share with your family and friends. You can also follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. We can be found everywhere now, and we want you to join us on this philosophical journey. Now, Dan, what do we have today for the viewer?
Okay. All right, folks. Imagine a world where railroads stretch across continents, laws govern nations, and languages unite billions and billions, like Trump said, but all born from the chaos of conquest. It's a sad truth, but it's a fact. Now, conquest and conquering are stained with blood, exploitation, but there were also moments of progress. And no, I'm not talking about one particular ideology. Besides European colonialism, I'm including when the Arab Muslims conquered North Africa and parts of Southern Europe. I'm including when the Soviet Union expanded throughout Central Asia. And yes, even when Mao took over. People think, have you lost your mind? No. I have to look at two sides of a coin. And this is a much more complex issue than people want to admit. In some cases, the standards of living became better. But now here's the question. Can good emerge from evil? So anyway, Joe, do you know that conquering powers, they built infrastructure that revolutionized connectivity, trade, and urban life? Yeah. And besides the Romans, who made like over 80,000 kilometers of roads throughout Europe, who also brought aqueducts and slightly improved literacy rates after they fell, the Arab Muslims, although they ravaged and raided North Africa, at the same time, they too started irrigation tunnels. And Joe, you know the Alhambra in Granada, Spain?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes,
that was built by the Moors, whether we like it or not. In fact, when the Arab Muslims conquered North Africa, the Middle East, and Southern Europe, at one point, it was when they were in what they call the Golden Age, where they were based upon science, logic, and reason, more so than religion. And now coming into another part, when certain European went around the world, they did introduce railroads. I'd give the British more credit than the French. And why? Because the French destroyed the railroads after they left, after they could no longer hold on to their colonies officially. But there's more. The Soviet Union, okay, for infrastructure, like this or not, prior to being a Soviet Union, Russia was a backwards agrarian country. People were, and when I say backwards, I mean farmers were using farm technology from like decades prior. But get this, it went from a backwater country to an industrialized one, and the Russians beat Americans into space, right? Am I correct on that one, Joe?
Yes. And again, folks, what Dan is referring to, a lot of these countries were being colonized, they were being conquered, other nations. At one point, for example, Britain controlled most of the world at one point in history.
Mm-hmm.
It brings us into, and philosophically, can good come from bad, or what some would say evil? For example, you're talking about how railroads systems were built. So basically, through colonialization, some good come at it. These laws, Dan, that build nations, for example. So the core argument, Dan, conquerors imposed legal systems that structured societies, often outlasting their rule in shaping modern governance, Dan. So, for example, in Vietnam, you still see elements of French influence. In the Philippines, you still see a mix of of Spanish influence and from 1905 American influence.
Yeah, I think it was 1898. 1898 is when they took over.
1898, 1899, but then America really after the Spanish left 1898 Spanish American War, then from 1900 on America started influencing the Philippines.
Right. And now take a look, though, also the Mongol Empire created the Yam postal system, which would deliver messages would travel about 300 kilometers a day, which was a lot faster than medieval Europe. And this one, a lot of people are going to get angry with me, but it's the truth. When the Japanese occupied Korea, they built over 6,000 kilometers of railways. from 1910 to 1945. Now, like it or not, the Korean Peninsula was industrialized when it was colonized by Japan. I mean, look, Mongols cut travel time across Asia by 70% because the Mongols improved the Silk Road a lot. And now here's a philosophical take: utilitarianism versus exploitation. Jeremy Bentham's greatest good, quote unquote, might praise a railway's utility, but Kant would demand we judge the intent, colonial profit over human lives. Which reminds me also of our own country of birth, the United States. Some people like to ignore the atrocities and say, well, look how much it's industrialized, how much it's unified by language. Okay, I admit it's been industrialized and it's unified by language, but at what cost? At what cost? And that's how I look at the Soviet Union industrializing, the same way I look at when American Indians that were slaughtered in masses, African slaves and all that. That's how I look at this, how the Soviet Union was industrialized. People were forced into labor, people died by execution and sometimes by starvation, or the elements got to them. Would you concur with me, Joe?
Yeah. Let's also give examples of influence for today. British common law adopted in India. To this day, 30 million cases yearly because of British common law are decided in India. There's still a hangover of British influence in India, even in 2025.
There's a British influence in our country too. I mean, look,
Absolutely.
what language are we speaking right now?
English. So
No.
exactly. The
Right.
Napoleonic Code spreads to 70 plus countries, and it influences 40% of the global legal system. Roman law, Dan, like you said, it's a basis for civil law in 150 plus nations. 60% of Europe's legal disputes, and the source is the legacy of Roman law, Cambridge University Press.
Now, although Spanish were pretty brutal colonizers, and to tell you the truth, they're among the least I'd want to be colonized by, but they had a certain system that involved into land codes. I think that's where the concept of area codes comes from. And although Spanish did among the most horrible atrocities, we cannot deny that people from Tijuana to Tierra del Fuego, Argentina, can communicate with a common language. I mean, was it worth it? I don't, but what was the intention of the conquistadors is something else.
Here's some shocking facts. India's 1860 Penal Code was written by British colonizers. It has convicted 10 million people since its independence, according to the Indian Penal Code. The source, Indian Penal Code, Government of India. The Napoleon's code was so efficient, it reduces court backlogs by 50% in occupied Spain.
Yeah, the Ottomans too. They processed 1,000 cases daily in just Istanbul alone. That's more than modern day New York. I mean, and speaking of which, the Ottomans granted legal autonomy to religious minorities. That's managing 15 million subjects across 3 continents. I mean, Ottomans, although they did sometimes make people pay what they called jizya tax, for the most part, they allowed freedom of religion.
And the philosophical take is legal transplants and justice. H.L.A. Hart saw law as social order. That's an interesting take in itself. But what if that order is foreign? If an outsider comes in, for example, conquers your country, but even though it's wrong to conquer, they leave some good things. Like, is legitimacy born from utility or consent? Like I said in look, America, what are we? We're speaking English. Like it or not, English for at least until now has been the language of the world, the business language that is. That what about living?
Language tourism. Sorry, say again.
What about progress at a price, Dan? The living standards because of colonization, because of what about living standards? Good or evil? Has good or evil been brought out of this?
Now, Now, in a lot of cases, the standard of living has been better. Okay, I'm not going to lie. British colonies typically have a better standard of living than, say, Belgian colonies did or Portuguese because of how it was governed. But here's my question, though. When people try to say, oh, it's bad and they try to justify it morally, I ask them, okay, if a woman was sexually assaulted and then impregnated, but her son or daughter grew up to be a multi-billionaire and their life got better, does that justify the woman being raped? Because the rapist had no intention of any of that. The point is, colonizers did it for themselves. They put the railroads in there for themselves.
Absolutely.
And not everybody in the colonies a lot of people did not benefit. A lot of people weren't even allowed to use them.
But there was benefactors still. Colonization boasted healthcare, education, economics through now, were the benefits skewed like you're making the point you're making and costly? Absolutely. Dan, here's a good example. Respond to this, Dan. Healthcare in British India. In India, at this time, hospitals rose from 1,200 in 1880 to 1902 had over 2,500 hospitals, and these hospitals treated 22 million patients annually. And this source comes from the public health in British India. So, what do you think of that? And obviously, like you said, they did it for themselves,
Right.
most likely. But now the citizen, through this colonization, has benefited to an extent.
Right. And the question is, you have to look at Kant's view too about intention versus Jeremy Bentham's view, which was about maximization, pleasure maximization. But that's what I wonder. How thankful should they be if they didn't get to consent to it? I mean, look, yes, literacy rates were indeed higher in British colonies, but still the people didn't get to consent whether or not the people were there. They didn't have the choice. In fact, it reminds me of something, another analogy. When I was growing up and I was struggling in school, some people would tell me, oh, you don't know how lucky you are to be in school. In other parts of the world, people don't even have the opportunity to go there. I'm like, well, I have something in common with those people. They don't get to, and they don't have the option to, and I have to. I don't have the option to say no. Yes, I'm glad that I'm literate. I'm glad that I'm educated, but I wonder how much of it was forced upon. Have you ever wondered that too, Joe?
Well, absolutely. Here are some shocking facts. Well, history, a lot of times the old saying is written by the victors. Shocking facts. British India vaccinated 20 million people against smallpox by 1900. That was more than Europe's entire population at that time. In that time period, colonial New England had higher life expectancy at 70 years than London, 35 years by 1750s. There's like I said, colonization and conquering is a mixed bag. It's a bad intent, especially if you're the nation being occupied against.
Right. And there's also the philosophical take. There's progress, like I talked about, but there's also paternalism. Now, Joe, although you got some years on me, you've always spoken to me as a man, as an equal.
Yeah, of course.
Right. I'm saying this, though. It's different when somebody might be older than you or richer than you or whatever, but they talk to you like you're lesser of a person. And with colonialism, or not just colonialism, but also Arab Muslims conquering North Africa, the non-believers, also Soviets conquering the Central Asian tribes, they still had this kind of paternal view saying, okay, yeah, I'm here to help, but it's still saying, I'm the parent, you're the child. I know best, and you don't have a choice. And so Jean-Jacques Rousseau might call this a false social contract because progress is imposed, not chosen. And here's the question, does the outcome matter more than the method?
Well, some would say at least an element of conquest, the core argument would be conquest unifies diverse regions through language, creating tools for communication and identity. The gift of a common tongue. Well, how about Spanish, Latin American, Dan? What can you tell us about?
With a few exceptions, with the exception of Brazil, Guyana, French Guyana also, and Suriname and Belize for the North and South America countries, mainland, most others can communicate. Yes, they speak their own unique dialects and all that, but somebody from Argentina can speak to somebody from Bolivia who can talk to someone from Honduras, who can talk to someone in Mexico, who can talk to someone, forward the message back to Chile, who can, you get the idea, who can send it again to Venezuela. And they all understand what each other are saying. The question is how it got there. And and in India, over 1 billion people live there. A good chunk of them speak English. And the other lingua franca of India is Hindi. But that wasn't the original case before.
How about this one, Dan? Arabic in the Middle East. It was written standard for 300 million born from conquest.
That's correct.
Russian Empire, Soviet Union. So, what about Mao's China, which we talked about China not too long ago? What about that one?
And this is where I say flip side. Yes, Mao was the biggest mass murderer of the 20th century. I cannot deny that. He committed horrible atrocities, like the Nazis, like the Soviets. But I also cannot deny that the other side of the coin is over 1 billion people in China are literate and they speak the same language. Well, they have their regional dialects, but there's a standardized language. So if a person from Xinjiang province wants to talk to someone from Guangzhou, who also wants to talk to someone in Yunnan, and then forward the message to Shanghai, they can all speak the same language, even simplified the Chinese characters.
Well, here's
So
a
that
shocking. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, go ahead. Sorry about
also we
that.
talk about social, but we also talk about personal motivation. I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that Mao wanted everyone to be literate so that they could read the propaganda, so they couldn't play
Well,
ignorance.
as we're talking about languages here, the common tongue, here's some shocking facts. Spanish replaced over 2,000 indigenous languages in Mexico alone, yet unable to sit a single legal system. So language is a unifier, even though it may have had some bad intents. English in India tripled bureaucratic efficiency, processing over 1 million documents daily by 1900. Now, you just talked about how Mao, obviously the guy was wicked, evil.
Yeah, he was. That's it.
Even
That's putting it very lightly.
even through his wickedness, simplified characters, he cut illiteracy from 85 to 20% in 20 years. That was faster than any nation in history, according to China's Great Leap, Jonathan Spence, the book. The philosophical take, Dan. What is the philosophical take?
Imperialism versus universalism. Does a lingua franca liberate or erase? You ever heard the term cultural genocide?
Yes.
Right. Now here's for an example. Some languages in the former Soviet Union were for a while repressed. Ukrainian, I think Latvian, Lithuanian, they were all mandated to speak Russian. Now, I don't think that those in authority really cared what people spoke at home. Maybe I'm wrong, but in schools and newspapers, media, everything, no, it had to be written in Russian. All broadcasts had to be done in Russian. And so that has two sides to it. But a person from today, even though Russia is not an official language of Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, or any of those, if you speak Russian, you can still communicate with a good number of people there. And again, like Mao, the Soviets did it for their own selfish motives. They wanted everyone to be able to read their propaganda and understand it.
Anyway, we're going to shift on to technology and industrial leapfrogs. This is an interesting one. The conquerors forced technological leaps, modernizing societies at an unprecedented pace. For an example, Dan, Soviet Central Asia, they had a 5-year plan to build 10,000 factories, producing 50 million tons of steel by 1950. And folks, you can get this source in industrialization in the Soviet Union. What about European Africa railways, Dan?
Well, as I was saying before, the railways and telegraphs that linked 20 million people by 1900, that was built by and for the colonial powers. Africans who did use it were the more privileged ones, but they couldn't do it without the colonizers' okay. And that's
Right.
something.
Oh, yes. And again, folks, we've said this earlier. A lot of the colonizers were doing this for themselves, but the locals and the I should say the citizens of this land and country at least got the benefit get the benefit from it. Like British Malaysia.
Yeah.
the
I mean,
tin
yeah, the
mining.
tin mining extracted 50% of the global supply.
What about
Also,
this
although
one? Yeah, go
what?
ahead. What about
I was going to
Japanese?
say,
Yeah, go ahead.
well, I was going to say also about rubber. Now, rubber is not indigenous to Southeast Asia. It's originally indigenous to Brazil, but the British brought it over there. And nowadays, I believe most rubber around the world comes from Southeast Asia. I mean, that's inevitable, but yeah, then you're mentioning about Japanese Taiwan, because
Yep,
Taiwan
they
was,
produced electricity, literally powered 90% of the homes by 1945. And some shocking facts: Soviet dams in Uzbekistan generated 20 billion a year, enough to light Western Europe. So, Dan, what about British telegraphs
well,
and Africa?
I already mentioned that all the
Yeah,
messages and all that.
we
But now
mentioned
Japan,
yeah, Japan
yeah, but
too.
yeah, Japan electrified the island of Taiwan 50 years before mainland China. And colonial priorities were at work, but again, that was for the Japanese. Now, Taiwanese, from what I understand in history books and from a professor, Taiwan was one of the few countries that weren't brutalized so bad by the Japanese imperial army. And I said, okay, so the Taiwanese did appreciate the fact there were railroads, infrastructure, electricity, and all that, but could they have said no to the Japanese? And my professor answered, that's right, they couldn't answer. So what's a philosophical take on this one, Joe?
Marx saw tech as history's engine, but when it's forced is a progress or domination.
Domination.
Domination. Yeah. So interesting because again, we've said this not to repeat ourselves, folks, but sometimes the colonizers are doing a lot of this stuff for their benefit. But now, even today, you see, despite a lot of bad intentions, you see populations, you see nations benefiting, and some good case studies on these colonies that thrived. Dan, some colonies leverage colonial legacies to become global powerhouses. Dan, what's an example? What about Hong Kong?
Hong Kong, yes. Hong Kong had an economic system that China itself later copied, and for its own benefit. As everyone knows now, China's an economic giant, only second to the U.S.
And how about this one? What about Singapore, for example? 400 billion GDP thanks to free trade.
Right. See, they were introduced once the British introduced that system with Chinese work ethic combined, because most of Singapore is Chinese.
Yes.
Chinese work ethic plus a British system together. Oh, nowadays Singapore is doing better than its former colonial master, which is the UK. In fact, India is now a bigger player in the economic world than its former colonial master, the UK. So here's the question. Yes, now that Britain and Singapore are more influential economically than the UK, it's like two sides of a coin, but they were still mistreated while they were colonies. They were treated like citizens.
Here's another example. South Korea under Japan, industrial base grew 10 times from 1910 to 45, and setting a post-war boom. So, so there you go. I mean, there's tons of examples, and this is a complicated issue, folks. Because
I mean, I hate to say it like this, but typically colonies that certain countries were much horrible at colonizing than others. Look at the Belgian colonies like the Congo, Burundi, and now Rwanda's better, but for a long time they were suffering. In fact, the difference when earlier colonial Europeans came to the Americas, the Spanish and the Portuguese went there mainly to loot, whereas the English went there to actually live and settle. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but people who want to go and settle in a place and live in a place are more likely to take care of it than people who are just going to be there temporarily. And where did I learn this? From some right-wing nut? No, I read this in the book, The Open Veins of Latin America, a leftist playbook in Latin America, for sure.
Well, a good philosophical take in this portion is this dependency versus agency. Did these nations thrive because of empire or by overcoming it? The dependency theory basically talks about the clashes with historical resistance. To answer that question, especially about thriving by empire because of empire overcoming, I think it's both.
Yeah, here's an analogy, Joe. I just thought this off the top of my head. Joe, if someone horribly bullied you when you were younger, okay, horribly bullied you, but later on you learned to fight because you were bullied from this person, and later on you run into that person, they're not the least bit apologetic, and they're as mean as they were back when they bullied you as a child, but the difference is you're tougher, you're stronger and tougher as a result. Is that kind of bittersweet or kind of just
Absolutely. It's absolutely. They had a bad intention by bullying me, but that bullying me also forced me to toughen up. Or so, yeah. And I think it's the same thing with the colonization. And I also think it could be both. Yeah, colonization was forced down a lot of countries' throats, but through the bad intentions, the building of the railroads and the technology, they benefited because of those bad intentions. Conquest seeded economies that fueled global trade and local growth. An example, British India cotton exports hit 2 billion here by 2023. By 2020, no, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry, 2 billion in 2023 dollars by 1900. Imagine $2 billion in 1900, back in 1900.
Well, by 2023 standards, yes. So, but yeah,
Yes,
the equivalent to 2
yes,
billion a day, 2 billion a
yes.
year. And the Spanish America's silver mines, especially that in Bolivia and Potosí, I think it's called. Silver mines produced more than 150,000 tons, which was 80% of the world's supply.
And of course, yeah, French
But no,
Haiti.
I'm saying, but
Yeah,
right,
French
but what did they
Haiti.
do? They exploited the hell out of the indigenous, though. I mean,
Absolutely. There was a lot of bad stuff done. French Haiti, sugar generated 300 million yearly by 1789.
mhm.
What about textile trade? Shocking fact. India's textile trade clothed 25% of Europe, yet workers earned pennies. And even make it today. These these cell phones we love to carry, whether it's Apple or whatever, there's people in factories earning nothing.
Yeah. Oh, and how about this? Everybody now here's talk about a twist of irony. The cobalt, which is in all of our smartphones and computers or laptops and what have you, they are, you know where those come from? Most of the cobalt comes from
Go ahead.
the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's often
I was
people
going
who
to
are,
say that.
yeah,
Yeah.
forced labor, often children, very poor wages, very low wages, and very, very poor conditions. I mean, and yet the irony of it all is that I learned from my smartphone that it was actually happening.
Well, there's also there's a massive dark side. We don't want to just glorify this. During these time periods, exploitation was rampant,
Mm-hmm.
but some legacies endure. Now, some of these legacies endured to what? Benefit modern society. Here's some key points quickly: slavery, genocide, theft, 12
Yeah.
million enslaved Africans, 45 trillion extracted from India. As an
Well, the
example.
12 million, that's just, I think that's just the United States alone. Never mind the rest of the Americas. And most of them went to Brazil. The majority of enslaved Africans went to Brazil. But then the Caribbean and, yeah, that's just,
British opium trade killed 2 million Chinese, yet funded India's railways. So there's a dark side. Belgium's Congo lost 10 million lives, but its roads still carry trade. Spanish,
yeah, but do you know about
yeah,
King Leopold II, though? He killed about 50% of the Congolese
yeah,
population.
but the point is we're giving quick examples here. Spanish conquest wiped out 90% of the Aztec population, yet Mexico's highways trace their paths.
Yeah, I mean, now people like to use excuse and say, well, come on, the Aztecs wiped out the people before them. Look what the Mayans did. They held slaves too.
And that may be true, but the point is for as a philosophical video, yes, we say the good, the bad, and the ugly, and that's what we do.
Right. Well, and this is, yeah, that's something I struggle with because, as you say, sometimes as history is told by the victors, sometimes it makes the conquerors look so righteous, and the conquered as previously, as savages, and sometimes it's the reverse. Sometimes it makes it look like the conquerors are all demons and the conquered were just innocent and pure and peaceful. Typically, though, I don't look at it. I look at it more like weaker versus stronger, and this includes when Muslims took over Southern Europe. Some people like to say, yes, Southern Europeans were in the Dark Ages. Come on, Arab Muslims went and brought infrastructure. They brought language. They brought light. They brought art. They brought science. I'd
Well,
say, I'd say, right. At the same time, though, they weren't chosen. They came by forcing, and
well,
others, yeah.
again,
Others like the other reverse. They'd like to say that Europeans were all peaceful and loving before the Moorish invasions, and that's just such a crock.
well, look, again, folks, these issues are complicated, and basically to summarize this, progress has been incredible progress. Yes, has it been stained by pain and at the expense of others? Absolutely. By pain, infrastructure laws, living standards, languages, technology, economies. Thriving colonies showed benefits we can't erase, but there was still a cost. It's that can still haunt to this day. The comes down to this: history is a paradox, and please tell us, folks, your takes in the comments. And
Yeah. Okay, folks. There's more on this topic, but this is all I want to say for today. So remember to like, subscribe, share, bang the notification bell. Please follow us on
and
Facebook, Instagram, X formerly known as Twitter, and
and
more.
the other thing is, if you have a suggestion of video you want done, you can always put it in the comments, or you have our email. You know our platforms now. Put it in there. what you like and what you don't like, and we'll take a look. Have a great day, evening, wherever you're at in the world.
Take care, folks.